This is a story about the breaking point of the human mind and how we learn to build a world that actually fits us. Behind the sleek, quiet cockpits of modern jetliners lies a history written in the wreckage of the past, a transformation from mechanical chaos to cognitive harmony. To understand the gravity of this evolution, we have to look back at how we first took to the skies and how we nearly lost our way in the process. This isn't just about aviation. It is the ultimate case study in how humans interact with complexity, a narrative of how we transitioned from being victims of our own technology to becoming its masters. In the earliest days of aviation, the era of the first Aero Squadron in the 1910s, flying was an exercise in pure, unadulterated sensory intuition. The cockpit wasn't a room, it was a chair strapped to a wooden frame. Instruments were almost non-existent because, at the time, we believed that a pilot's own body was the best sensor available. Early aviators, such as those flying the Curtiss JN-4 Jenny, relied on seat-of-the-pants flying. They judged their speed by the pitch of the wind whistling through the bracing wires of the biplane. They judged their engine's health by the smell of burning castor oil and the rhythmic vibration beneath their feet. The very few instruments they had were often improvised, like a simple piece of string tied to a strut. If the string blew straight back, you were flying straight, and if it drifted sideways, you were in a skid. There was a romanticism to this era, a sense that the pilot and the machine were one singular, organic entity. But this romance was built on a fragile foundation, as pilots were essentially guessing their way through the atmosphere. As we pushed into the 1920s, this reliance on human senses became a death trap. Humans are evolved for life on the ground. When you lose sight of the horizon, inside a cloud or in the dead of night, your inner ear fails. The vestibular system, which relies on the movement of fluid in the semicircular canals to detect orientation, is easily fooled by centrifugal force. A pilot might feel like they are banking left when they are actually flying level, or worse, feel level while spiraling toward the Earth. This leads to spatial disorientation, a terrifying state where the brain rejects reality in favor of a lethal hallucination. The first great leap forward happened in 1929, led by Jimmy Doolittle. He realized that for aviation to be a viable form of transport, we had to stop trusting our feelings and start trusting the machine. This era introduced the first blind flying instruments, the artificial horizon and the directional gyroscope, developed by the Sperry Gyroscope Company. For the first time, a pilot could look at a dial and see where the Earth was, even if they couldn't see the ground. It was the first time we admitted that human biology was insufficient for the environments we were creating. By the 1930s and 40s, aircraft were becoming more than just scouts or mail carriers. They were becoming weapons of war and tools of global commerce. This necessitated longer flight times, which meant more systems to monitor. We added fuel gauges, oil pressure sensors, manifold pressure indicators, and radio navigation needles. However, these were all standalone devices. There was no concept of ergonomics or flow. Each dial was a separate island of information, and the pilot had to be the bridge between them. During World War II, the stress of combat amplified the flaws in this design. Pilots would often retract their landing gear instead of their flaps, because the levers were identical and placed right next to each other. It was here that we saw the first glimmers of shape coding, making a landing gear lever feel like a wheel and a flap lever feel like a wing, so a pilot could distinguish them by touch alone in the heat of battle. As we transitioned into the 1950s and 60s, the peak of the steam gauge era, the problem reached a new, more bureaucratic crisis point. Aircraft like the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8 were massive, multi-engine marvels that required constant monitoring. However, engineers at the time followed a philosophy of accumulation rather than integration. If a new system was added, be it a specialized hydraulic pump or a new radio frequency, a new physical dial was simply bolted onto the board wherever there was open space. No one looked at the cockpit as a holistic user interface. It was treated as a storage locker for data. By the 1960s, a long-haul captain was staring at over 150 individual instruments. This was the era of the flight engineer, a third crew member who sat sideways behind the pilots to manage a literal wall of gauges, fuel pumps, electrical breakers, and hydraulic pressures that the pilots couldn't even see without physically turning around. The cockpit had become a plumbing shop. If an engine began to overheat, a needle the size of a toothpick would move a fraction of an inch on a 3-inch dial. There was no master caution light. There was only the scan, the exhausting, mechanical movement of a pilot's eyes checking every dial every few seconds, for hours on end, waiting for one tiny anomaly in a sea of static information. The psychological toll of this era cannot be overstated. Pilots were suffering from data fatigue, a condition where the sheer volume of information causes the brain to shut down or miss critical cues. In the 1970s, the aviation world hit a psychological wall. The machines were getting safer, but the humans were breaking under the weight of the data they were expected to process. This was tragically proven in 1972 with the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 in the Florida Everglades. The plane was a Lockheed L-1011, one of the most advanced steam gauge aircraft ever built. While preparing to land, a single $12 light bulb failed to illuminate. It was the nose gear down indicator. The entire flight crew, the captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer, became so fixated on that one tiny bulb that no one noticed the autopilot had been accidentally bumped, causing the plane to slowly descend. This event introduced the world to cognitive tunneling. Under stress, the human brain narrows its focus so sharply that it can actually tune out audible alarms and the physical sensation of descending. Those pilots flew a perfectly healthy multi-million-dollar jet into a swamp because they were trapped in a design that gave them too much data and not enough meaning. They were looking at the world through a keyhole, and that keyhole was a broken light bulb. This failure gave birth to the formal discipline of human factors engineering. Designers finally stopped asking what information they could show and started asking how a human actually processes stress, light, and movement. The first major result was the basic T layout. They took the four most critical instruments, airspeed, attitude, altitude, and heading, and mandated they be in the exact same spot on every single aircraft in the world. This offloaded the mental tax of searching for data and replaced it with an instinctive knowing. If you were a pilot, you didn't have to think about where your altitude was. Your eyes simply knew where to land. Then came color logic. In the old cockpits, every gauge was white markings on a black background, making it impossible to prioritize urgency. Now they utilized the brain's primitive survival centers by creating a strict hierarchy. Green meant the system was normal, amber meant caution, and red meant immediate danger. This simple shift allowed a pilot to instantly triage a situation during an emergency, ignoring the green sea of stability to focus on the red island of crisis. By the 1980s, the transition from analog to digital, the glass cockpit, changed the fundamental nature of the pilot's job. Aircraft like the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 757 replaced mechanical needles with computer screens. This allowed for contextual layering, a concept that is now the gold standard for all user interfaces. A screen doesn't have to show you everything all the time. It only shows you what matters right now. During takeoff, the screen shows engine thrust and critical speeds. During cruise, it hides those details and shows navigation and weather. If the fuel temperature is normal, that data is hidden entirely, lurking in the background until it becomes relevant. This led to the dark cockpit philosophy. In a modern jet, if the systems are healthy, the overhead panels are dark. No lights. No distractions. A light is no longer a status indicator, it is an intrusion. Behind these screens, systems like EICAS and ECAM were born. They moved the pilot from the role of a manual mechanic to a systems manager. The computer now filters thousands of data points and only speaks when it has something important to say, protecting the pilot's limited cognitive bandwidth for high-level decision-making. The shift to glass also allowed for a massive reduction in crew size. The flight engineer, that third person sitting sideways, was replaced by a computer that could monitor hydraulic pressures and electrical loads with far more precision and without the risk of fatigue. This wasn't just an economic move, it was a safety move. By reducing the number of people in the cockpit, you reduced the potential for communication breakdown. However, it also introduced a new challenge: automation dependency. As planes became smarter, pilots began to spend more time monitoring screens and less time actively flying. This led to a new type of accident, where pilots would forget how to manually handle the aircraft when the computers failed. The industry had to pivot again, teaching pilots that while the computer is a powerful ally, the human remains the final authority. Beyond the visuals, engineers had to solve the average pilot myth, a discovery that revolutionized physical ergonomics across all industries. In the 1940s, cockpits were designed to fit the average measurements of a pilot, but researchers eventually realized that literally zero pilots possessed average dimensions in every category: arm length, sitting height, and leg reach. When you design for the average, you design for no one. This led to the invention of adjustable seats and rudder pedals, moving away from static metal boxes to elastic environments that could mold to the human body. This shift in anthropometry ensured that a pilot could reach a critical kill switch in a split second, regardless of their physical stature. It was an admission that technology must bend to the user, not the other way around. This concept eventually trickled down into everything from office chairs to car dashboards, changing the way we think about the fit between man and machine. The evolution of lighting also played a critical role in preserving the pilot's most valuable tool: night vision. Early cockpits used harsh red lighting because it was believed to protect the rods in the human eye from being bleached by bright light. However, red light had a hidden cost. It made it impossible to read traditional color-coded maps or distinguish between amber and red warning lights. Modern cockpits have shifted to high-definition, low-intensity, cool white, or blue-green lighting, which allows for perfect color rendering while remaining gentle enough to keep the pilot's eyes adjusted to the dark void outside the windshield. This careful management of the spectrum ensures that when a pilot looks out the window into a pitch-black night, their eyes are already prepared to see the faint lights of a distant runway or another aircraft. It is a subtle but vital example of how engineering respects the biological limitations of the human eye. Safety also moved from the eyes to the ears with the introduction of voice warning systems, famously nicknamed Bitchin' Betty. Designers realized that in a state of high-stress cognitive tunneling, a pilot might go instrument blind, seeing the dial but not processing the number, but they rarely go audio deaf. Instead of a generic siren that added to the ambient panic, synthetic female voices were introduced to provide calm, direct instructions like pull up or terrain. A female voice was chosen because its frequency stood out more clearly against the low-frequency rumble of jet engines and the typically male-dominated radio chatter of the era, ensuring the warning broke through the pilot's mental fog. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command that bypassed the analytical brain and went straight to the motor cortex. Interestingly, this eventually led to the development of quiet cockpit procedures, where unnecessary chatter is banned during critical phases of flight, such as takeoff and landing, to ensure that the human processor isn't overloaded by secondary noise. The physical interface for steering the plane also split into two distinct philosophies, the yoke versus the side stick. Boeing maintained the traditional yoke, a large steering wheel between the pilot's legs that moves physically when the autopilot or the other pilot makes a change. This provides tactile feedback. You can see and feel what the other pilot is doing. If the captain pulls back on the yoke, the first officer's yoke pulls back too. Airbus, however, revolutionized the space with the side stick, a small joystick to the pilot's side that frees up the space directly in front of them for a fold-out table and better screen visibility. This wasn't just about comfort. It was a debate over how a human best feels the machine they are controlling. The side stick uses fly-by-wire technology, where the pilot's input is a suggestion to a computer, which then executes the safest possible version of that maneuver. It is the ultimate expression of the machine acting as a protective layer between the human and the laws of physics. Airbus stick inputs are additive rather than mirrored, a design choice that requires a different kind of training and trust between crew members. One of the most significant invisible changes was the transition from command and control to crew resource management, or CRM. In the early days, the captain was a sky god whose decisions were never questioned, leading to dozens of accidents where junior officers saw a mistake but were too intimidated to speak up. This authority gradient was a literal killer. Modern cockpit design facilitates a team-based approach, with shared screens and centralized consoles that encourage both pilots to cross-check each other's work. The layout itself now enforces a culture of verify and validate, turning the cockpit into a collaborative workspace rather than a rigid hierarchy. We learned that the most dangerous component in a cockpit wasn't a faulty engine, but a broken social dynamic. This philosophy has since been adopted by surgical teams and nuclear power plant operators, proving that the lessons of the cockpit are universal. To keep the pilot's eyes where they belong on the world outside, Engineers adapted head-up displays, or HUDs, from fighter jets into commercial airliners. A HUD projects critical flight data onto a transparent piece of glass at eye level, allowing a pilot to see their airspeed and altitude superimposed directly over the runway. This prevents the dangerous head-down transition during the most critical seconds of landing, where a pilot has to move their focus from a bright screen to a dark, rainy landing strip, which can take the human eye several seconds to adjust. It allows the pilot to stay in the world rather than in the data. When combined with enhanced vision systems, EVS, which use infrared cameras to see through fog, the HUD becomes a window into a reality that the naked eye simply cannot perceive. Behind the scenes, the rise of real-time telemetry and the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS, has turned the cockpit into a node in a global network. Modern planes are constantly whispering to ground stations, sending thousands of data points about engine health, fuel efficiency, and even the smoothness of the flight every second. This means that often, ground crews know a part is going to fail before the pilot does. This predictive maintenance has taken the surprise out of mechanical failure, allowing the cockpit to remain a place of planned actions rather than frantic reactions. The pilot is no longer alone in the sky. They are the tip of a spear supported by thousands of analysts and algorithms on the ground. As we look deeper into the digital heart of the plane, we see the rise of the electronic flight bag, EFB. In the past, pilots had to carry heavy suitcases filled with paper charts, manuals, and approach plates. A single mid-sized jet could carry 40 pounds of paper. Today, that has all been distilled into a single tablet. This isn't just about weight, it's about searchability and accuracy. In an emergency, a pilot can search for a checklist in seconds rather than fumbling through a binder. This speed is life. However, even this transition required careful human factors study to ensure that the tablet's screen brightness didn't ruin night vision and that the interface was usable during heavy turbulence. Finally, we are entering the era of biometric monitoring and augmented reality. New research is exploring cameras that track a pilot's eye movements, identifying when they are staring too long at one gauge fixation or when their eyes are drooping fatigue. Sensors in the seat can monitor heart rate and skin temperature to detect the onset of stress or micro-sleeps before they become a danger. If the system detects the pilot is losing focus, it can subtly increase the brightness of the screens, change the cabin temperature, or even trigger a haptic pulse in the seat to provide a sensory nudge. We are moving toward a future where the cockpit doesn't just show the state of the plane, it understands the physiological and psychological state of the human pilot. This evolution from chaos to clarity isn't just about aviation history. It is the blueprint for how we interact with all technology today. It is the reason your smartphone doesn't show you its entire file system while you're trying to send a text. It is the reason your car's dashboard dims everything except the speedometer at night. It is the reason the most important buttons in a well-designed app are the easiest to find. We have moved from an era of total information to an era of actionable intelligence. The real lesson of the cockpit is that good design doesn't demand perfection from the user. It assumes the user is tired, stressed, and easily distracted. It doesn't fight for your attention, it protects it. When you encounter a piece of software or a workflow that feels unnecessarily complicated, remember that it is a design failure, not a personal one. Cockpits didn't become elegant because of an aesthetic choice. They became elegant because we realized that in the moments that matter most, humans need clarity more than they need data. We spent a century and countless lives learning how to turn noise into meaning. The goal was never to replace the human, but to give the human the space to do what only they can do, make a high-stakes decision under pressure. The next time you see a simple, clean interface, don't just admire the look. Admire the decades of chaos that had to be silenced to make it that way. We are no longer just passengers in the machine. We are the consciousness at its center, finally supported by a world that was built to hold us. As we look toward the future of automation and artificial intelligence, the cockpit remains our most vital teacher. It reminds us that as systems become more complex, the interface must become simpler. If we ignore this, we risk falling back into the plumbing shop of the 1960s, surrounded by power we cannot control and data we cannot understand. The transition from the wooden frame of the JN4 Jenny to the biometric sensing glass cockpits of tomorrow is not just a story of better engines or faster wings. It is the story of how we learned to respect the limits of the human mind, and in doing so, finally gave ourselves the freedom to truly fly. It is a testament to the fact that the most important part of any machine is the person using it, and that the greatest engineering feat of all is making the complex feel invisible. In the end, this journey from the string-on strut to the multispectral HUD is a journey of humility. It is the story of humanity acknowledging that while our dreams can take us into the stratosphere, our bodies and minds are still rooted in the savannah. We built the cockpit not to conquer nature, but to translate it into a language we can understand. We created a cognitive cocoon that shields us from the overwhelming complexity of Mach-speed travel, allowing us to remain the masters of our fate. Whether you are a pilot navigating a storm or a student navigating a complex digital world, the lesson is the same. The machine must serve the mind, or the mind will eventually fail. The elegance of the modern cockpit is the quiet evidence of our survival. It is the proof that when we listen to our own limitations, we find our greatest strengths.